somewhere in the green farmland of central Switzerland, on a grey January morning in 1975, a one-armed farmer walked out of his modest home and looked up at the sky. What he saw next, or what he claimed to see, would set in motion one of the most documented, most debated, and most deliberately obscured contact events in the history of the modern world. His name was Edward Albert Meier. The world would come to know him simply as Billy. And if the documents buried inside Cold War intelligence archives are to be believed, documents that analysts were never supposed to find, what happened on that hillside was not a hallucination, not a hoax, and not a weather phenomenon. It was the beginning of something so significant that 3 separate Western intelligence agencies quietly moved to ensure the public would never take it seriously. This is not the story of whether Billy Meier was telling the truth. This is the story of why the truth, whatever it was, had to be controlled. Tonight we go deep into one of the most extraordinary cases ever assembled. A case where the photographs were too good, the witnesses too credible, and the official silence too perfectly coordinated to be anything other than deliberate. Find a comfortable position. The lights are low, and somewhere above the Swiss Alps something is still waiting. The canton of Zurich sits in the northern heart of Switzerland, a landscape of ordered fields, dense pine forests and villages that have existed nearly unchanged for hundreds of years. The people here are known for precision and privacy. They do not, as a cultural rule, invent stories. Hinwil was, in 1975, a small agricultural settlement roughly 40 kilometres southeast of Zurich. Population, modest. Industry, farming, and light manufacture. The kind of place where strangers were noticed immediately, and where unusual events, if they occurred at all, spread through the community in hours. Edward Meier was 40 years old that January. He had been born in 1937 in the village of Bulach, the son of a cobbler. His childhood was unremarkable except for one recurring theme that would define his entire adult life. He claimed, from the age of 5, to have experienced periodic contact with non-human intelligence. These early claims, which Meier documented in personal notebooks, were dismissed by family and neighbours as the fantasies of an imaginative child. But Meier was persistent in a way that imagination alone rarely sustains across decades. By the time he reached adulthood, he had travelled extensively. He had lived in India, Turkey, and across Central Europe. He had worked manual labour, lost his left arm in a bus accident in Turkey in 1965, and returned to Switzerland with a young wife, Calliope, known to friends as Poppy, and a growing family. He was, by any external measurement, an unlikely candidate for international controversy. That changed on the morning of January 28, 1975. According to Meier's own account, written in careful, methodical detail that same day, he had received an internal impression, which he described as a form of mental signal or telepathic notification, that he should travel to a specific location in the fields outside Hinwil. This was not, he emphasised, unusual for him. He claimed such impressions had been occurring for years, though with increasing frequency and clarity since 1973. He drove his moped to the location indicated. He was alone. What he documented upon arrival has been analysed, disputed, replicated, attacked, and quietly studied by aerospace engineers, intelligence analysts, photographic experts, and researchers across 4 decades and more than a dozen countries. He saw a disc-shaped metallic craft, hovering without sound at low altitude above the field. He described it as approximately 7 meters in diameter with a domed upper section and a flattened lower hull. The surface appeared to be a brushed metal, not reflective like polished aluminum, but luminous in a way that seemed to emanate light rather than reflect it. The air around the craft was completely still. No displaced wind, no engine noise, no sound of any kind that he could place against any existing reference point in his experience. And standing beside the craft, or perhaps emerging from it, he was never entirely certain, was a figure he would describe in subsequent writings as Semjase. Semjase, he wrote, was a woman, or appeared to be. She stood approximately 160 centimetres tall, slightly above average for a Swiss woman of that era. Her features were fine-boned and symmetrical. Her clothing was a one-piece silver-grey suit without visible seams. Her hair was long and a pale blonde. Her eyes were large, widely spaced, and of a colour that Meier struggled to describe in his native German, eventually settling on a term that translates roughly as deep blue gold. They communicated, he said, through a process that was partly verbal. She spoke a language that he did not recognise but somehow understood, and partly what he could only describe as direct thought transfer. Ideas arrived in his mind fully formed, bypassing his ears entirely. The content of what was communicated covered topics that Meier, a farmer with a basic education, could not have been expected to address with any fluency. Orbital mechanics, planetary geology, the history of civilizational development across timescales that dwarfed human recorded history, and, most pressingly, a series of specific warnings about the trajectory on which Earth's civilization was currently travelling. The encounter lasted, by his estimate, approximately 40 minutes. When he returned home that afternoon, he sat down and wrote 14 pages of notes. He drew diagrams. He sketched the craft from multiple angles. He recorded the content of what had been communicated with the systematic thoroughness of a man who understood, even in those first hours, that he was going to need to prove something that most people would instinctively refuse to believe. The following day, he went back, with a camera. Between January of 1975 and the late months of 1978, Eduard Meier took a series of photographs that have never been satisfactorily explained away. This is not a subjective claim. It is a matter of documented forensic history. He shot initially on a 35mm film camera, a standard consumer-grade device available to any Swiss household of the era. He later acquired a Polaroid camera, which he used for a smaller number of images, the photographs number in the hundreds. The most analysed of them, the ones that have been studied under computer enhancement, photogrammetric analysis, spectral light modelling, and multiple independent forensic reviews, show a consistent, physically coherent object in genuine aerial suspension. That last phrase matters enormously. Genuine aerial suspension. When investigators in the late 1970s began applying what were then cutting-edge photographic analysis techniques, borrowed from satellite imagery processing developed for the space race, they were looking specifically for evidence of models on strings, for evidence of objects attached to poles or wires, for evidence of double exposure or darkroom manipulation. They found none. The shadow geometry was consistent across photographs taken at different times of day, meaning the light source was not artificial, and the object was not a small model held close to the lens. The parallax relationships between the object and background landscape elements confirmed that the craft was, in the images, genuinely distant from the camera, not a few centimetres away on a string, but many metres away in open air. One analysis, conducted by a former aerospace imaging consultant who asked not to be named in publications, noted that the reflective properties of the craft's surface changed correctly between images as the craft rotated, something that would require extraordinary expertise to fake with a physical model and would be effectively impossible to fabricate through standard darkroom technique of that era. Remember, this is 1975, 1976, 1977. There is no desktop computer. There is no software capable of image manipulation that would be accessible to a Swiss farmer. Consumer digital cameras are 2 decades away. If Billy Meier faked these photographs, he did so using techniques that professional special effects studios of the era could not have matched without months of work and substantial resource investment. His farm showed no evidence of such equipment. His finances showed no capacity for it, and witnesses in the surrounding community reported seeing Meier at or near the locations depicted, alone, with his small camera, on ordinary Swiss afternoons. The photographs spread first through European research networks, loose communities of scientists, military veterans, and independent investigators who had been quietly cataloguing aerial anomaly reports since the early 1950s. Many of these individuals were former military or intelligence-adjacent professionals. They were not, as a group, credulous people. Their response to the Meier photographs was striking in its caution. Where they might have expected to dismiss the images in minutes, they found themselves writing careful, hedged memos to one another, noting that the imagery was more consistent with an actual aerial object than with any known fabrication method available to a civilian in rural Switzerland. That caution, that careful, professional reluctance to simply laugh the thing away, is itself a data point worth holding in mind as this investigation unfolds. Within months of the initial photographs circulating through European research circles, something changed in the quiet landscape around Hinwil. Local residents, dairy farmers, retired school teachers, a road crew working on a bridge project 3 kilometres from Meier's property, began noticing vehicles they did not recognise. Not the beaten farm trucks and family sedans of the canton, clean vehicles, often dark-coloured, parked for long periods in positions that offered clear sightlines to the fields Meier frequented. A postal worker named Hans, whose surname has been withheld in every published account of this period, told investigators years later that he had seen, on at least 4 separate occasions between spring and autumn of 1975, what appeared to be observation equipment set up on a hillside overlooking one of Meier's documented contact locations. Tripod-mounted, professional grade, operated by individuals dressed in ordinary civilian clothing who responded to his wave with silence and expressionless stares. The Swiss Federal Police, when asked about unusual activity in the Hinwil region during this period, stated publicly that no investigations had been initiated and no reports had been filed. This is technically accurate. Which is interesting, because technically accurate is not the same as completely true. No Swiss investigation had been initiated. That much appears to be genuine, but the vehicles the postal worker noticed were not Swiss, and the individuals operating observation equipment on that hillside were not conducting a Swiss federal investigation. The question of who they were, and under whose authority they operated, is a thread that runs through every serious examination of this case, and it will not resolve cleanly until we reach the classified archives discovered nearly 5 decades later. For now, note only this. Within months of Billy Meier's first documented event, unknown external observers had established surveillance positions in the fields outside Hinwil. They were watching the same skies he was watching. They were photographing the same locations he was photographing. The difference was that they didn't want anyone to know they were there. To understand why Western intelligence agencies would take any interest whatsoever in a one-armed Swiss farmer who claimed to photograph alien spacecraft, you need to understand the specific paranoia of the mid-1970s Cold War intelligence environment. The world in 1975 and 1976 was not at peace. It was in a state of carefully managed tension between 2 nuclear superpowers who had each concluded, independently, that the other was capable of developing technology that would be indistinguishable from magic, stealth aircraft, satellite surveillance, directed energy weapons, hypersonic delivery systems. The gap between publicly known technology and classified reality had become enormous, so enormous that the line between a genuine, extraordinary capability and a Soviet deception operation had become, for intelligence analysts, genuinely blurry. Anomalous aerial phenomena had been classified as a dual-threat problem since the late 1940s. The primary concern was Soviet. Any unexplained object seen over Western Europe or North America could represent classified Soviet technology. The secondary concern was domestic. Mass sightings of unexplained aircraft could cause public panic, military miscalculation, or, most dangerously, premature disclosure of classified Western technology if the military was forced to explain what people had seen. Both threats required monitoring. Both required containment. Against this backdrop, a case like Meier's represented a very specific kind of problem. He was not reporting a single, fleeting, ambiguous sighting. He was reporting repeated, sustained, documented encounters in a consistent geographic location. He was producing physical evidence, photographs, circular depressions in the soil, scorched vegetation at landing sites that could not be immediately dismissed. And he was doing this with increasing openness, inviting investigators to examine his evidence, encouraging publication, building a public following. This was, from an intelligence management perspective, exactly the scenario that required early, decisive intervention. Declassified summaries from this period, released in heavily redacted form through various freedom of information processes, confirm that Western agencies maintained active monitoring files on civilian contact claims that demonstrated specific characteristics: repeated sightings in a fixed location, physical trace evidence, photographic documentation, and civilian investigator involvement. The Meier case met every single criterion. An internal classification label that appears in at least 2 separate intelligence summaries, designation stripped, authoring agency redacted, reads simply, persistent contact claim, civilian source. The notation that follows is partially obscured by redaction, but the visible text includes the phrase requires narrative management, which is, in intelligence terminology, not an instruction to investigate. It is an instruction to control. Lieutenant Colonel Wendell C. Stevens was not the kind of man who chased fantasies. He had spent 20 years in the United States Air Force, serving in roles that required both technical competence and high-level clearance. His assignments touched on aerial reconnaissance and the analysis of exotic aerial phenomena at a time when those files were among the most classified in existence. He retired from active duty in 1963, and by the early 1970s had become one of the most respected civilian researchers in his field, respected specifically because of his methodological rigour and his refusal to accept evidence that failed to meet military-grade analytical standards. When Stevens first heard about the Meier photographs in 1976, his initial response was dismissive. Another Swiss mystic, he told an associate, another farmer who saw something strange and built a mythology around it. But then he saw the photographs. Stevens travelled to Switzerland in 1976 and again in 1977. He spent extended time with Meier, interviewing him over dozens of sessions, examining his original film negatives, walking the contact sites, speaking with local witnesses. He brought with him a network of professional contacts in the aerospace and photographic industries who could provide technical analysis that met evidentiary standards. What he found over 2 years of investigation was, by his own account, the most physically substantive contact case he had ever encountered. His analysis of the original negatives, craft in the images, his analysis concluded, exhibited characteristics of genuine 3-dimensional objects photographed at genuine distance. Stevens published his findings in 1982 in a book-length investigation that laid out his methodology, his evidence, and his conclusions with the careful, structured clarity of a military intelligence report. He stopped short of declaring Meier's account entirely factual. He was too disciplined for categorical claims, but he stated unambiguously that the evidence taken as a whole could not be explained by conventional means. The response was immediate, coordinated, and, to anyone paying close attention, deeply peculiar in its efficiency. Within months of Stevens's publication, a comprehensive debunking campaign appeared across multiple media outlets in multiple countries nearly simultaneously. Mainstream newspapers in the United States, United Kingdom, and West Germany ran dismissive articles citing unnamed photographic experts. Television programs ran segments in which critics demonstrated how small models on strings could, under certain conditions, produce photographs vaguely similar to Meier's. Research organisations that had previously expressed cautious interest in the case publicly reversed their positions. The coordination was striking, not because any single piece of it was impossible. Negative media coverage of unusual claims was common, but because of the speed, the breadth, the simultaneity. Investigative media campaigns, even well-resourced ones, take time to organise. Editors need to be briefed, journalists need to write, publications need to schedule. A campaign that unfolds across 4 countries in 3 languages within weeks of an inconvenient publication does not happen organically. Stevens noticed this. He wrote about it in private correspondence. He mentioned it in interviews. Nobody in the mainstream press found it worth discussing. The specific mechanism of the debunking campaign is worth examining carefully because it reveals something important about how the suppression of uncomfortable information actually works in practice. It does not work through direct denial. Direct denial draws attention and invites investigation. If a government agency had simply said Billy Meier is lying, the natural journalistic response would have been to ask how they knew. and what evidence they had, and why they cared enough to say so at all. Instead, the campaign operated through what might be called selective evidentiary focus. Among the hundreds of photographs in Meier's collection, critics selected approximately 8 to 10 images and subjected those specific images to aggressive scrutiny. They found, in some cases, elements that could be interpreted as consistent with model photography, a slightly unusual grain pattern here, a reflection artifact there. On the strength of these selected images, the entire body of evidence was declared fraudulent. The logical flaw in this approach is elementary. Disproving or casting doubt on 8 photographs from a collection of several hundred does not disprove the remaining photographs. It proves only that 8 photographs may be problematic. The rest remain exactly as unexplained as they were before. But that logical flaw was never pointed out in mainstream coverage, because mainstream coverage was not constructed around logic. It was constructed around narrative, and the narrative was clean, satisfying, and final. Mistaken farmer, flawed photos, case closed. The public accepted it with the grateful relief that people typically feel when a complicated and unsettling thing is suddenly explained away. Nobody had to worry anymore. There was a normal explanation, the experts had figured it out, except the experts had not figured it out. They had simply focused their attention on the smallest possible slice of the evidence until they found something questionable, and then declared victory while the rest of the evidence quietly continued to resist explanation in laboratories and research institutions that the cameras never visited. This pattern, selective focus, narrative conclusion, public reassurance, is not accidental. It is a method. And it appears, when you examine the historical record of aerial anomaly case management across the second half of the 20th century, with a consistency that suggests institutional design rather than coincidental repetition. Parallel to the photographic evidence, and in some ways more significant, if less immediately dramatic, was the body of written material that Meier produced over the course of his contact years. Beginning in 1975, Meier kept detailed written records of every encounter he claimed to have, with Semjase and subsequently with other individuals who he said identified themselves as members of the same cultural group. These records, eventually published collectively under the title The Contact Notes, run to thousands of pages of transcribed conversations, philosophical discourse, technical description, and what can only be described as prophetic statement. The prophetic content is the portion that most quickly catches the attention of modern readers, and for good reason. Within conversations allegedly recorded between 1975 and 1978, the contact notes contain references to the progressive degradation of Earth's natural ecosystems due to industrial pollution and resource extraction, specific to the destabilization of ocean temperatures, the emergence of increasingly extreme weather events as a consequence of atmospheric disruption, rising political instability across the Middle Eastern region centered on resource conflict and territorial disputes, the development of global surveillance infrastructure through civilian technology, particularly communication devices, that individuals would voluntarily carry on their persons, the consolidation of economic power in increasingly smaller numbers of institutional entities, the emergence of pandemic-scale health crises arising from human encroachment on previously isolated biological environments. Each of these statements, taken alone, might be dismissed as vague enough to apply retrospectively to almost any development. That is the standard objection to prophetic literature, and it is a fair objection. But the contact notes are not, on examination, vague. They contain specific technical language. They describe mechanisms, not just events. And they were, in several documented cases, shown to investigators before the events they described took place. Stevens, for one, documented cases in which Meier shared contact note material with him during their 1976 and 77 visits that described specific geopolitical developments, which subsequently occurred in the early 1980s. Stevens was careful in his documentation precisely because he anticipated the retrospective fitting objection, so he dated and notarized the pre-event showings with the care of a man who understood the evidentiary standards he would eventually need to meet. Whether the contact notes represent genuine non-human communication, an extraordinary intuitive mind operating on available information, or something else entirely is a question this investigation declines to answer definitively. What it does note is this: intelligence analysts, as a professional category, are paid specifically to assess the accuracy of information from unusual sources. And at least 3 documented intelligence summaries from the late 1970s referenced the Meier contact notes as material requiring content-level analysis. They were not simply watching to see if he was a nuisance. They were reading what he was writing, and in at least some cases they found it worth archiving. In the mid-2000s, a series of Freedom of Information requests, filed by multiple independent researchers in the United States, the United Kingdom and Canada, began to yield partial, heavily redacted documents relating to Cold War monitoring programs. What emerged, document by document, was a picture of systematic, long-term, multinational monitoring of civilian contact claims that went far beyond anything the agencies involved had previously admitted to publicly. Among the released material, buried in appendices and referenced obliquely in summary documents, were multiple notations relating to a persistent civilian contact claim, Swiss origin, 1975 to 1978. The notations are not detailed. The underlying files, if they still exist, have not been released. But the fact of the monitoring and the fact that this case was tracked, categorized and referenced across multiple summaries over multiple years is documented. And it raises a question that the agencies have never been asked to answer publicly. If the case was clearly a hoax, as mainstream media declared it to be, why was it still being tracked in classified summaries as late as 1981? Hoaxes do not generate multi-year classified monitoring programs. They generate brief memos and case closure. What generates multi-year classified monitoring programs is a situation that remains, from the agency's perspective, unresolved. A situation in which the official public conclusion and the private analytical conclusion are not the same thing. Cold War doctrine included a discipline known as perception management, the deliberate shaping of how civilian populations understood and interpreted events. It was applied to military capability, to political narratives, to presentation of enemy nations, and, crucially, to the management of information that could cause uncontrolled social disruption. Anomalous aerial phenomena fell into this last category, beginning in earnest in the late 1940s, when the volume and credibility of reports reaching military channels made it impossible to simply ignore the question any longer. A classified report produced by a CIA-convened panel of scientists and military officials in 1953, substantially declassified in subsequent decades, included a recommendation that public interest in unusual aerial phenomena should be actively reduced through a campaign of debunking, ridicule, and the encouragement of skeptical public narratives. The goal was not, the panel noted, to resolve the question of what people were seeing. The goal was to prevent uncontrolled public reaction to whatever people were seeing. This distinction is important. The agencies were not in the truth business, they were in the stability business. And stability, in their calculus, required that ordinary people not become convinced that extraordinary things were happening in the skies above their homes without an official explanation being ready and waiting. In this context, a case like Meier's represented not just a local anomaly, but a stress test of the entire management framework. Here was a civilian contact claim that was producing compelling physical evidence, attracting serious investigators, and generating growing public interest, all in a Western European country during a period of heightened Cold War tension. Internal documents from this era suggest that planners had considered, in theoretical terms, what a genuine publicly visible contact event would require in terms of narrative management. Several of those documents appear to reference the Meier case not as a confirmed extraterrestrial event. The agencies never confirmed anything, but as a real-world test of the management, protocols they had spent decades preparing. What is the response time of credulous media when a debunking narrative is introduced? How quickly does public ridicule suppress investigation? How many serious researchers can be dissuaded from continued inquiry through professional pressure alone? These are useful questions if you're preparing for something much larger, and the Cold War intelligence community was, in the 1970s, very quietly preparing for something much larger. The most concrete evidence of external intelligence presence in the Hinwil region during the contact years comes not from declassified documents, which remain, for the most part, heavily redacted, but from the memories of people who lived there. Memory is, of course, an imperfect instrument. It distorts under time and expectation. It fills gaps with inference. These are standard objections to witness testimony, and they are legitimate, but they apply less forcefully when multiple, independent witnesses interviewed separately, decades apart, and without knowledge of one another's accounts, describe the same anomalous events in consistent detail. Among the residents of Hinwil and its surrounding communities, who were interviewed by various researchers between the 1980s and 2000s, a pattern emerges with striking regularity: unmarked helicopters. This detail appears in at least 7 separate witness accounts from the late 1970s, not military-marked helicopters, which would have been explainable and noticed for different reasons. Unmarked, dark-painted, flying low, at times and in patterns inconsistent with agricultural or emergency services operation, equipment on the hills. Multiple witnesses describe, independently, having noticed what appeared to be electronic or optical equipment, positioned on elevated ground with clear sight lines to the flat fields, where Meier's contact events were most frequently documented. Antenna, structures, mounted optics. One retired farmer described what he could only call boxes with small dishes, set up overnight and gone again within days, foreign observers. At least 4 separate accounts describe individuals who are clearly not local, speaking languages that witnesses identified variously as English, French, and an unidentified Eastern European language, moving through the region during the peak contact years. These individuals, when approached by locals, offered vague cover stories: birdwatchers, surveyors, research students. None of their institutional affiliations were verifiable by the people who asked about them. Switzerland's geopolitical neutrality made it, from a multinational intelligence operation perspective, nearly ideal. No single nation had jurisdiction. The oversight frameworks that would have applied to similar operations on treaty member territory did not apply in the same way. And the Swiss domestic security apparatus, while professional and capable, had no particular mandate to scrutinise the activities of foreign observers conducting apparent civilian research. The region around Hinwil was, in the late 1970s, a quiet space in a geopolitically advantageous location where multiple external agencies could observe the same events without being required to share their conclusions with one another or with the host nation. It was, in a specific and careful sense, perfect. Among the physical evidence Meier produced during the contact years, the audio recordings occupy a particular place of interest because they have, over 4 decades of analysis, consistently resisted dismissal in a way that even some of his critics have privately acknowledged. Beginning in 1975, Meier claimed to have made audio recordings of the craft associated with his contact events. These recordings were made on a standard consumer-grade portable cassette recorder, the technology most Swiss households would have used in that era for ordinary purposes like recording music or family conversations. The recordings were analysed initially in the late 1970s by a small number of independent audio engineers, some of whom had backgrounds in aerospace acoustics and military sonar. Their findings were cautious but consistent. The recordings contained frequencies and modulation patterns that did not match any known civilian or commercial aircraft of the period. The sounds were not helicopter rotor wash, not propeller aircraft, not jet engine output. They occupied frequency ranges that were, at the time of analysis, not associated with any documented propulsion technology in the public record. This finding was noted and then largely set aside, as the debunking campaign successfully shifted public focus away from evidence examination and toward the more photogenic question of whether small models could be suspended on fishing line. But the audio recordings continued to be analysed, quietly, by individuals working outside the mainstream research context, engineers and acousticians who encountered the recordings as technical curiosities rather than ideologically loaded evidence. In the 2000s, a former aerospace engineer who had spent decades working on advanced propulsion system acoustics reviewed the Meier audio recordings. His analysis, shared in an independent technical forum, noted something that he found genuinely puzzling. The frequency modulation characteristics in the recordings bore significant similarity to acoustic signatures associated with experimental electromagnetic propulsion concepts that had only begun to receive serious engineering attention in the 1990s and 2000s. In other words, the sounds on the recordings resembled propulsion technologies that, as far as the public record shows, did not exist as engineering concepts until 15 to 20 years after the recordings were made. The most uncomfortable possible explanation that what Meier recorded was an operational form of technology that humanity, in the conventional public sense, had not yet developed, is the one that no mainstream outlet has ever discussed. It remains sitting in the technical literature like a quiet, unanswered question. In the late autumn of 1978, something changed in the Meier contact record, abruptly, without a gradual tapering, without a period of reduced frequency that might suggest natural end of interest. The large-scale, publicly documented sightings around Hinwil simply stopped. Meier's explanation, as recorded in the contact notes, was that the extraterrestrial individual known as Semyase had sustained an injury during an unspecified encounter and had been withdrawn from active contact. He expressed distress at this in his writings, not the clinical distress of a man managing a public narrative, but the personal distress of someone who had lost access to something he considered genuinely important to his life. The external record around this same period is suggestive in ways that do not resolve cleanly in either direction. The frequency of reported aerial anomaly sightings in the Hinwil region, tracked independently by Swiss civilian skywatchers and noted in local records, declined significantly in the same period. The unmarked vehicles that local residents had noticed near Meier's contact sites disappeared. The hillside equipment positions were, as best as investigators can determine, no longer occupied. Researchers who have studied this period note a coincidence worth examining. In late 1978, classified space-based reconnaissance capability had significantly upgraded satellite coverage of Western European airspace. The need for ground-based monitoring in neutral territory would have diminished correspondingly. And perhaps the contact events themselves, whatever their source, had provided whatever data they were going to provide. The timing of the end is, if nothing else, interesting. Not gradual, not ambiguous. An abrupt cessation that coincides, within months, with the end of the most intensive period of external surveillance, the debunking campaign reaching its conclusion, and classified satellite coverage of the region improving dramatically. Coincidences accumulate until they stop being coincidences. The question is always how many you are prepared to hold simultaneously before the weight of them forces a different kind of conclusion. Lena Weiss was 34 years old when she first encountered a reference to the Meier case in a context that had nothing to do with the question of extraterrestrial life. She was a journalist based in Zurich, working primarily in the field of Cold War historical documentation, specifically the reconstruction of intelligence operations that had been conducted on Swiss soil during the 1960s, 70s and 80s. It was precise methodical work that required mastery of 4 languages, facility with archival research across multiple national systems, and a tolerance for years-long projects that might ultimately yield nothing publishable. She was good at it. She had published 2 well-regarded investigations, one into Cold War intelligence entanglements within Swiss financial institutions, and one into the quiet use of Swiss neutrality for multinational signals monitoring operations, that had earned her a reputation for documentary rigour respected across the European investigative journalism community. The reference she encountered was buried in a NATO signal monitoring summary from 1977, a document she had located through a partially successful Freedom of Information request to the Belgian National Archives, which held certain administrative documents from the era. The summary, which concerned aerial signal monitoring over Western European airspace during a specific series of dates in 1977, contained a notation she did not initially understand. It referenced Swiss aerial anomaly events, fixed geographic origin, civilian source, and cross-referenced a file number that appeared in the same summary in association with intelligence monitoring of what the document called persistent contact claim activity. She spent 3 days tracing the cross-reference before concluding that it almost certainly related to the documented Meier case, which she knew only vaguely from its cultural afterlife as a dismissed story. Most journalists would have set the notation aside at that point. It was a tangent from her main research thread, associated with a topic that carries sufficient social ridicule to damage professional reputations even when treated with careful rigour. The rational calculus argued strongly for moving on. Lena Sayers was not good at moving on from things that did not add up. She travelled to Hinwil on a grey February morning, almost, exactly, 48 years after the morning Billy Meier had driven his moped out to that field in 1975. The farmland was as she had imagined it, quiet, ordered, indifferent to significance. The hills where the witnesses had described observation equipment were wooded now, grown over with the unhurried persistence of vegetation reclaiming ground that human attention had briefly occupied and then abandoned. The original contact sites were identifiable only through Meier's own documentation. Nothing in the landscape itself marked them as extraordinary. She found the witnesses reluctant to speak. Some of the early investigators she attempted to contact were unwilling to revisit the topic. The reluctance was not hostile. It was the specific reluctance of people who had, at some point in the past, been burned for their willingness to engage with a subject that the broader culture had designated as socially hazardous. They had learned their lesson. They had moved on. They did not want to unlearn it. The investigation that Vice conducted over the following 18 months was, in its methodology, entirely consistent with her previous work. She treated the Meier case not as an inquiry into extraterrestrial life, but as a Cold War intelligence history, a case of monitoring, management and information control applied to a civilian individual whose activities had attracted institutional attention. This framing allowed her to approach the evidence without the ideological loading that typically distorts both believers and debunkers when they engage with this subject. She was not interested in whether Meier had really photographed alien spacecraft. She was interested in what the intelligence record showed about who had been watching him, why, and what they had concluded. The pattern she eventually mapped was more complex than she had initially anticipated. She obtained, through a combination of Freedom of Information requests and archival research across 5 national archives, a partial but coherent picture of the external monitoring operation around Hinwil. The monitoring was not conducted by a single agency. It was, she concluded, a loose collaboration between at least 3 Western intelligence entities, coordinating through informal channels rather than formal treaty structures, precisely because the informal arrangement allowed each participant to maintain plausible deniability about the nature and conclusions of the operation. She then compared the timeline of documented Meier sightings against the timeline of classified aerospace development programs that have been partially declassified in the decades since. The overlap she found was not simple or clean. It never is in genuine archival research, but it was significant. Several of the peak periods of Meier's documented contact events corresponded to known periods of intensive classified aerospace testing in Western Europe. Programs involving experimental propulsion concepts, atmospheric research platforms, and early satellite positioning system tests that required specific geographic triangulation from ground points. She was careful not to overstate this. Correlation is not causation. Overlap in timeline does not prove relationship. But it raised a hypothesis she found genuinely uncomfortable, that at least some of what Meier was documenting and what the intelligence community was monitoring was classified human technology being tested in the Swiss airspace corridor, alongside whatever else might or might not have been occurring. This meant, if her hypothesis was correct, that the agencies monitoring the situation had an additional reason for aggressive narrative management beyond the standard protocols. They needed to prevent civilian investigators from cataloguing classified aerospace assets that happened to be operating in the same airspace where Meier's alleged contacts were taking place. The cover story of a dismissed hoax served 2 purposes simultaneously. It discredited the civilian witness, and it obscured whatever else was in the air. Among the documents Vice eventually located was an internal communication, origin agency still classified, dated 1979, that laid out, in terms more explicit than anything previously available in the public record, the principle underlying the narrative management approach applied to cases like Meier's. The document is partially redacted. What remains visible includes a passage that, translated from the original bureaucratic language, states approximately the following. The most effective mechanism for preventing sustained civilian investigation of sensitive aerial phenomena is not denial, which invites further inquiry, but ridicule. Ridicule activates social enforcement mechanisms independent of official action. Once a subject is publicly associated with irrationality, credible investigators self-select out of engagement. Institutional funding becomes unavailable, and peer pressure among journalists and academics sustains the dismissal without requiring further resource expenditure from managing entities. Read that again slowly. The most effective mechanism is not denial, it is ridicule. Because ridicule activates social enforcement mechanisms independent of official action. This is not speculation. This is a documented institutional principle found in a partially declassified government document describing the deliberate use of social dynamics to suppress investigation without requiring direct governmental involvement. The agencies did not need to threaten journalists. They did not need to confiscate evidence. They did not need to silence witnesses through legal action. All they needed to do was ensure that the initial public narrative frame was ridicule, and then human social psychology did the rest, automatically, sustainably, essentially for free. Weiss recognised this pattern from her previous work. She had seen it applied to the Swiss banking investigations, the initial dismissal of investigators as conspiracy theorists, the social pressure on journalists who pursued the story, the eventual official acknowledgement that came only after the institutions involved had had sufficient time to manage the damage. The mechanism was identical. The scale was different. The subject was different. The mechanism was identical. Billy Meier had not been defeated by evidence. He had been defeated by a social technology that was, by 1979, well developed, institutionally understood, and deliberately applied. The question of what actually happened in those Swiss fields remained, as it had always remained, unanswered. The deepest layer of the archival evidence Weiss uncovered is also, appropriately, the most ambiguous. It comes from a single, partially declassified briefing document, its origin agency designated only by a two-letter code that does not correspond to any publicly known agency designation, dated 1981. The document appears to be a summary briefing, prepared for a senior official, of conclusions reached after 5 or more years of monitoring the Meier case. It is written in the careful conditional language of institutional analysis. Every claim hedged, every conclusion preceded by phrases like available evidence suggests, or cannot be excluded that. It is, in short, exactly the kind of document that a senior intelligence analyst would produce when reporting on a situation where certainty was unavailable and the stakes of being wrong were very high. Most of the document remains redacted. What is visible runs to approximately 1,200 words in the original language, of which perhaps 800 have been translated and shared in the research literature. The visible text contains the following assessment. It cannot be excluded that the contact events documented by the civilian source represent a deliberate managed disclosure protocol originating from an intelligence of non-human origin, designed not to transfer specific information, but to assess the response capabilities of governing institutions when confronted with undeniable physical evidence presented through a single low-credibility civilian channel. Pause on that for a moment. Not to transfer specific information, to assess the response capabilities of governing institutions, the hypothesis being entertained by senior intelligence analysts in a classified briefing document in 1981 is that the Meier contact events were not random. They were a test, and the subject being tested was not Billy Meier. It was us, humanity, specifically the institutions through which humanity governs itself. The question being asked, according to this interpretation, when presented with undeniable physical evidence of non-human contact through a single civilian channel, a channel specifically selected for its vulnerability to ridicule, what does humanity do? The answer, delivered by the 1979 debunking campaign, was, it suppresses, ridicules, and forgets. Whether the extraterrestrial intelligence implied by this hypothesis actually exists, whether the briefing document is authentic, and whether the analysis it contains reflects genuine intelligence conclusions or elaborate speculation, are questions that cannot be resolved with available evidence. What can be said is this: someone, at some level of the Cold War intelligence apparatus, was considering this possibility seriously enough to include it in a classified briefing summary prepared for a senior official. In the world of intelligence analysis, what gets briefed to senior officials is not wild speculation. It is the most serious assessment of available evidence that the analyst can produce. Among the later contact notes materials, those produced in the early 1980s, after the period of peak public activity had ended and the mainstream media had long since moved on, there is a passage that has attracted less attention than it deserves. It is attributed, as always, to the communications transmitted through the contact framework established with Semjei and her colleagues. It is written in the careful, somewhat formal style that characterises all of the contact notes, not colloquial, not rhetorical, but deliberately precise in a way that sometimes reads as alien not because of its subject matter, but because of its register. In translation, it states approximately the following: the current phase of contact is concluding not because information transfer is complete, but because the observable stability of the receiving civilization is insufficient for the next phase of open interaction. The required threshold is not technological. It has been established that the technological capacity will develop according to observable trajectory. The required threshold is institutional and psychological, the capacity to receive confirmation of non-human intelligence without fracturing the social structures through which the civilization coordinates collective response. That threshold has not been reached. Contact will resume when it has. This passage was written, according to the contact notes dating, in 1982. The date of the last large-scale publicly documented Meier sighting cluster aligns, within a margin of a few months, with the same period. Whether this alignment means anything at all depends on what you believe about the source of the contact notes. If they are genuine transmissions from non-human intelligence, a position that requires accepting premises most rational people are not prepared to accept, then the alignment is significant. The contact ended because it ended deliberately, by the decision of the contacting party, at the moment the contacting party determined that open engagement was not yet productive. If the notes are Meier's own creation, whether conscious or unconscious synthesis of his intuitions and observations, then the alignment means that he was aware enough of what was happening around him to write a conclusion that fit the observable facts with uncomfortable precision. Either interpretation is, in its own way, interesting. The gap between them is where this case has always lived. Vice published her investigation to a response that was, as she had perhaps expected, a smaller-scale mirror of the 1979 debunking campaign. Credulous outlets embraced her findings without the nuance she intended. Mainstream press dismissed the investigation without engaging with its archival sourcing. Several academic colleagues who had previously expressed respect for her work quietly distanced themselves. The institutions she had named, not as guilty parties but as documented participants in a management operation, remained silent. The silence, she noted in a subsequent interview, was the most informative response she received. Organisations that have nothing to hide do not strategically decline to respond to specific archival documentation. They issue corrections or clarifications, or they invite the researcher to review additional material. They engage. The silence was the engagement. She did not claim, in her investigation, that Billy Meier had been visited by extraterrestrial intelligence. She claimed only what the documents showed, that he had been monitored, that the monitoring had been extensive and multinational, that the debunking campaign had been coordinated in ways that documentary evidence supported, and that at least one senior intelligence analyst had, in a classified briefing document, entertained the possibility that the contact events represented a deliberate protocol from non-human intelligence designed to measure humanity's institutional response. She presented the evidence. She laid out the methodology. She invited examination. The silence held. There is a specific kind of loneliness that attaches to the Billy Meier case. a loneliness that has nothing to do with whether his encounters were real. It is the loneliness of being the canary in the coal mine at a moment when the institutions managing the mine have decided that the public is better served by not knowing about the coal. Meier spent the 1970s walking out into Swiss fields with a camera and a notebook, and a stubborn conviction that what he was experiencing was important enough to document. He invited scrutiny. He preserved his evidence. He answered investigators' questions for decades without the kind of self-protective withdrawal that guilt or calculation might have produced. The response he received, from the institutions he could see and from the institutions he could not, was a systematic, professionally managed exercise in making him not worth taking seriously, and it worked. For most people. For most of the public. For most of the time. But it did not work on everyone. It never does. There are always the investigators who read the technical analysis, the archivists who find the classified notations, the journalists who cross-reference the NATO summaries, the engineers who listen to the audio recordings and realise that the frequencies do not match anything that should have existed in 1975. These individuals do not form a community of believers. They form a community of people who find that the official account does not satisfy the evidence, and who are professionally or personally unable to simply set the discrepancy aside. Perhaps the Billy Meier case was never meant to convince everyone. Perhaps it was never meant to convince anyone in the conventional sense of settled, demonstrable, institutionally ratified truth. Perhaps, and this is the hypothesis that the classified briefing document of 1981 suggests, and that nothing in the subsequent 4 decades has convincingly ruled out, it was meant only to measure something. To measure how humanity responds when the impossible appears in plain sight, in broad daylight, photographed with a consumer camera by a one-armed Swiss farmer who had no motive for invention beyond a deep and documented conviction that what he was experiencing was real. The measurement, as far as the available evidence suggests, was taken. The result was recorded, and somewhere in an archive that has not yet been declassified, in a briefing document that has not yet been released, there may be a conclusion about us, about our readiness, about what happens next, that is waiting for a civilization stable enough to hear it. Before we dive into tonight's story, if you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you could possibly know. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review makes a huge difference for us. And if you feel like it, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in. If you enjoy these deep dives into the mysteries and conspiracies that shaped our world, consider subscribing. It means everything. And a massive thank you to Jeff Anon for suggesting tonight's story. This one's a chilling piece of history that almost no one talks about. In early November 1983, military screens across Eastern Europe began lighting up with signals that looked exactly like the prelude to nuclear war. Encrypted transmissions flooded NATO channels. High-ranking officials disappeared into secure bunkers. Nuclear-capable aircraft moved into position. But this was supposed to be just a drill, an exercise, a simulation. Except one side believed it was real. What you're about to hear is the story of Able Archer 83. The weaker training exercise nearly triggered the apocalypse. It's the story of how the world came within a hair's breadth of nuclear annihilation, not because of aggression or malice, but because of misunderstanding. And it's the story of why, for decades, almost no one was told just how close we came. This is the week the world almost ended. Chapter 1. A World on Edge. To understand Able Archer. 83. You have to understand the world it happened in. 1983 was not a good year to be alive on planet Earth. The Cold War, that decades-long standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union, had entered one of its most dangerous phases. The brief thaw of détente in the 70s had frozen over. Trust between East and West had evaporated. In its place was something far more volatile: paranoia. Ronald Reagan had been in the White House for nearly 3 years, and his approach to the Soviets was aggressive in ways the previous administration had never been. He called the Soviet Union an evil empire in public speeches. He authorized the largest peacetime military build-up in American history. He talked openly about winning a nuclear war, about Star Wars missile defense systems, about confronting communism wherever it existed. To Americans tired of feeling weak after Vietnam and the hostage crisis in Iran, Reagan's rhetoric was invigorating. To the Soviets, it sounded like the warmongering of a man preparing for war. On the other side of the Iron Curtain, Yuri Andropov had recently taken control of the Soviet Union. Andropov was not well. The former head of the KGB was suffering from kidney failure, spending more time in hospitals than in the Kremlin. But illness had not softened him. If anything, it had. Made him more suspicious, more convinced that the West was planning something catastrophic. Andropov had spent his career in intelligence. He knew how to read signals, he knew how to spot patterns, and in 1983, every signal he saw pointed to war. Earlier that year, on September 1st, Soviet fighters had shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007, a civilian Boeing 747 carrying 269 people. The plane had drifted into Soviet airspace, and in the climate of suspicion that dominated Moscow, military commanders made a decision. They fired. Everyone on board died, including a sitting United States congressman. The international outrage was immediate and fierce. Reagan called it an act of barbarism. The Soviets, rather than apologizing, doubled down. They claimed the plane was on a spy mission, that it was deliberately probing their defenses. Conspiracy theories erupted on both sides. Was it really an accident? Was it a setup? Did the Americans send that plane into Soviet airspace on purpose to provoke a response? Did the Soviets shoot it down knowing it was civilian just to send a message? The truth most likely was simpler and sadder than either conspiracy. It was a tragic mistake born of fear. But in the autumn of 1983, no one was in the mood for simple explanations. The world was on edge. The superpowers were glaring at each other across a line that had been drawn in blood and concrete. And into this atmosphere of mistrust and tension, NATO introduced an exercise called Able Archer 83. But to truly understand the paranoia of 1983, you need to understand what daily life felt like in that moment. In American living rooms, television shows were interrupted with updates about Soviet troop movements in Afghanistan. In European capitals, peace protesters filled the streets, opposing the deployment of American Pershing II missiles on their soil. These weren't symbolic weapons. They were intermediate-range nuclear missiles that could strike Moscow in less than 10 minutes from launch. The Soviets had their own equivalent systems pointed west, SS-20s that could turn London, Paris or Bonn into ash before anyone had time to evacuate. The nuclear arsenals of both superpowers had reached obscene levels. The United States possessed more than 10,000 strategic nuclear warheads. The Soviet Union had roughly the same. But it wasn't just about quantity. It was about hair trigger alert status. Submarines lurked beneath the Arctic ice, their missile tubes loaded and ready. Bomber crews lived on bases with their aircraft fueled and armed, prepared to launch within 15 minutes of receiving orders. Missile silos across the Great Plains and the Siberian steppes were manned around the clock, their crews running through launch checklists during endless shifts, trained to turn 2 keys simultaneously the moment the order came. This was the doctrine of launch on warning. Both sides had adopted it because both sides feared a decapitation strike, a surprise attack designed to destroy leadership and command centres before they could retaliate. If you waited until you confirmed that enemy missiles were actually incoming, it might be too late. Your communications might be cut. Your commanders might be dead. Your missiles might be destroyed in their silos. So the policy became, if you see something that looks like an attack, launch everything immediately. Don't wait for confirmation. Don't hesitate. Just fire. Mad, mutually assured destruction only works if the other side knows you'll retaliate, and you can't retaliate if you're already dead. This created a system where false alarms became existentially dangerous. In 1983 alone, there had been multiple incidents where early warning systems malfunctioned. Radar operators saw phantom bomber formations that turned out to be flocks of geese, satellite sensors registered missile launches that were actually sunlight reflecting off clouds. Computer errors generated attack warnings that required human operators to make split-second decisions. Is this real, or is this a glitch? Every time someone chose correctly. Every time disaster was averted. But every time the margin of error got smaller. And then there were the war games. Both sides played them constantly. Psychological operations designed to probe the other's reactions, to test response times, to gather intelligence on procedures. Soviet bombers would fly toward NATO airspace, forcing Western fighters to scramble, testing how quickly they could get airborne. American submarines would shadow Soviet ballistic missile subs, seeing how close they could get before being detected. It was a constant game of chicken played with nuclear weapons. The problem was that all these provocations, all these tests, all these exercises created a baseline of tension so high that distinguishing between routine provocation and actual attack preparation became nearly impossible. The Soviets were used to NATO running exercises. NATO was used to Soviet aggressive maneuvers. It was background noise in a world where everyone was always on edge. But Able Archer wasn't going to be background noise. Able Archer was going to be different in ways that nobody fully understood yet. And those differences, those small changes in procedure and participation, were going to bring the world closer to annihilation than any deliberate act of aggression ever had. Chapter 2. What Able Archer was supposed to be NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, held military exercises constantly. It was part of maintaining readiness. In the event of a Soviet invasion of Western Europe, NATO needed to know that its member nations could work together, that communication systems functioned, that chains of command held. Exercises were routine, they were scheduled, they were predictable. Able Archer was supposed to be one of those exercises. It was a command post exercise, sometimes called a CPX. That meant it wasn't about moving tanks or flying combat missions. There would be no troops in the field, no shots fired, not even blanks. Instead, Able Archer was a simulation conducted from headquarters and bunkers, a test of whether NATO's leadership could coordinate a response to Soviet aggression. It was a tabletop exercise on a massive scale. The scenario was straightforward, at least on paper. NATO commanders would simulate a period of rising tensions with the Warsaw Pact. They would practice issuing orders, moving imaginary units, coordinating between nations, and crucially, they would simulate the procedures for escalating to nuclear release, the process by which NATO's nuclear arsenal would be authorized and deployed. Previous Able Archer exercises had been held before. They happened annually. Everyone knew the rhythm. NATO would run the drill, the Soviets would watch with mild interest, and everything would go back to normal. It was theatre. Everyone understood it was theatre. But Able Archer 83 was different. The exercise was scheduled to run from November 2nd to November 11th, 1983. From the outset, NATO planners decided to make this iteration more realistic than any before. They wanted to test their systems under conditions that mimicked actual war as closely as possible. They wanted to see if the mechanisms of nuclear command and control could function under pressure, so they changed the script. They introduced radio silence periods, simulating communications blackouts that would occur during war. They used new, encrypted communication systems that Soviet signals intelligence had never seen before. They moved the exercise through DEFCON levels in a way that mirrored how a real conflict might escalate. And most significantly, they incorporated participation from the highest levels of NATO leadership. Previous ABLE, Archer drills had been run by mid-level officers. This one would involve officials at the level who would actually authorize nuclear strikes. The exercise would simulate the release of nuclear weapons with a degree of verisimilitude that had never been attempted before. To NATO, this made perfect sense. If you're going to test a system, test it realistically. If you're going to practice for the apocalypse, practice seriously. But here's the problem. From the outside, how would anyone know this was fake? Chapter 3. When the drill changed. Able Archer. 83 began on November the 2nd with what NATO considered standard procedures. Commands were issued. Units, fictional units, began moving through the simulation. Headquarters staff settled into the rhythm of the exercise. But within the first 48 hours, something unusual happened. Soviet intelligence officers monitoring NATO communications noticed the changes immediately. The radio traffic was different. Frequencies that had been quiet were suddenly active. Encryption patterns had shifted. NATO forces were using communication protocols that Soviet analysts had never intercepted before. Then came the movement of personnel. Senior NATO officials began leaving their normal posts and heading to secure locations. In previous exercises, this hadn't happened. Colonels and generals ran the drills. But in early November 1983, ambassadors and ministers started disappearing into bunkers. The kind of people who would actually be involved in authorizing nuclear war were participating in the exercise. To NATO, this was exactly the point. They were testing the full chain of command. But to Soviet observers, it looked like the West was preparing for something real. Let's walk through what happened day by day, hour by hour, from both perspectives. November 2nd, Day 1. At Supreme Headquarters, Allied Powers Europe, SHAPE, located in Casto, Belgium, the exercise began at 0800 hours Central European Time. The scenario called for a period of rising political tensions between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Simulated intelligence reports indicated Soviet troop build-ups along the East German border. Fictional diplomatic protests were drafted. The exercise moved slowly, deliberately, giving participants time to practice coordination. In Moscow, intelligence analysts at the GRU, Soviet military intelligence, began receiving reports from their agents in Western Europe. NATO communication patterns had changed. The volume of encrypted traffic had increased significantly. Routine messages that usually went over standard channels were now being sent through secure networks. The GRU flagged this as unusual but not yet alarming. They'd seen exercises before. They noted it in their daily reports and continued monitoring. November 3rd, Day 2. The exercise scenario escalated. The fictional Soviet invasion of fictional Western Europe began in the simulation. NATO commanders practiced issuing defensive orders. Imaginary units moved to imaginary positions. But the communications about these movements were real. The radio traffic was authentic. The encryption was genuine military-grade cryptography, and the movements weren't entirely imaginary. As part of the exercise realism, certain NATO aircraft were actually relocated. Not fighters or bombers carrying live weapons, but reconnaissance aircraft and command and control planes that would be used in an actual war. They moved to dispersal airfields, spreading out to avoid being caught bunched together if an enemy strike occurred. This was standard procedure for a realistic exercise. But to Soviet radar operators tracking these movements, the dispersal looked exactly like what NATO would do if they were actually preparing for war. In East Germany, Soviet commanders began asking questions. Their intelligence officers couldn't explain why this exercise felt different. The previous, years Able Archer had been straightforward. This one had new elements they hadn't briefed on. Orders came down from Moscow. Increase observation. double the number of reconnaissance flights. Report any unusual activity immediately. November 4th, Day 3. This was when Able Archer introduced one of its most provocative new elements, radio silence. For 6 hours, NATO went almost completely dark. Routine communication frequencies fell silent. The normal chatter of military coordination vanished. In its place, only occasional bursts of heavily encrypted transmissions on frequencies that weren't part of the standard NATO communications architecture. From the Western perspective, this made perfect sense. In an actual war, the Soviets would target communication systems immediately. NATO needed to practice operating under communications blackout conditions. They needed to prove they could maintain command and control even when normal channels were down. From the Soviet perspective, this looked like NATO was hiding something. When you're about to launch a surprise attack, one of the first things you do is impose radio silence. You stop broadcasting your position. You stop giving away your intentions. You go dark, and then you strike. Soviet signals intelligence stations across Eastern Europe reported the silence to Moscow. The reports landed on desks at the KGB, at the GRU, at Soviet military headquarters. Analysts cross-referenced the timing. The silence had begun at 1400 hours Central European time. NATO aircraft had dispersed the previous day. Senior officials had moved to bunkers. Encrypted communications had increased. And now, silence. The indicators were stacking up. November 5th, Day 4. The exercise scenario reached a critical threshold. In the simulation, NATO forces were being pushed back by the fictional Soviet invasion. Conventional defences were failing. The scenario called for NATO to contemplate the use of tactical nuclear weapons, small battlefield nukes designed to stop advancing armour columns. This was where Able Archer moved into genuinely unprecedented territory. Previous exercises had generally stopped before the nuclear threshold. They'd practice conventional response, work through logistics and coordination, and then wrap up. But Able Archer 83 was designed to test the entire escalation ladder. NATO wanted to know if their procedures for nuclear release actually worked, so they practiced them. Specific messages were sent using the actual formatting and authentication codes that would be used in a real nuclear release order. Obviously, the authorization codes themselves were simulated. The alphanumeric strings that would actually unlock weapon systems were kept secure. But everything else was real. The message formats, the communication channels, the backup procedures, the confirmation protocols. At NATO's nuclear weapons storage sites across Europe, security forces were briefed on the exercise scenario. Some bases ran drills where, as part of the simulation, they practiced the procedures for mating nuclear warheads to delivery systems. They didn't actually bring weapons and aircraft together. That would have been dangerous and provocative. But they rehearsed the choreography. They timed how long it would take. They tested whether the communication systems could reliably transmit release authorization from headquarters to the individual units that would carry out strikes. And Soviet intelligence watched all of it. Agents operating near NATO bases reported increased security activity. Perimeter patrols were reinforced. Access procedures were tightened. At several locations, personnel with specific technical qualifications, the kind of specialists needed to arm nuclear weapons, were seen entering high-security areas. In Moscow, the reports were compiled and analysed. The GRU produced an assessment that landed on Yuri Andropov's desk on the evening of November 5th. The assessment noted the unusual characteristics of Able Archer 83. It highlighted the participation of senior leadership. It emphasised the radio silence period. It pointed out the dispersal of aircraft and the increased activity at nuclear storage sites. The assessment concluded with a paragraph that, in retrospect, was chilling. The current NATO exercise demonstrates characteristics consistent with preparations for a surprise nuclear strike. While we cannot rule out that this is indeed a training exercise, the operational security measures and communication protocols observed exceed those of previous drills, recommend elevated readiness posture of Soviet forces pending clarification of NATO intentions. Andropov, already predisposed to believe that the Americans were planning something, authorized the recommendation. Soviet military forces in Eastern Europe began moving to higher alert levels, and NATO had no idea. November 6th, day 5. This was the day that Able Archer simulated the decision to use strategic nuclear weapons. Not just battlefield nukes, but intercontinental ballistic missiles and long-range bombers targeting the Soviet homeland. The exercise scenario had escalated to the point where fictional NATO was facing fictional defeat. Fictional Soviet armies were fictional miles from the English Channel. In this nightmare scenario, the alliance had to decide: accept defeat or escalate to full nuclear exchange. They chose escalation, at least in the simulation they did. The exercise controllers issued orders simulating the release of strategic nuclear forces. Messages went out to bomber bases. Simulated targeting packages were transmitted to missile commands. The scenario played out the choreography of Armageddon. From NATO's perspective, this was the whole point of the exercise. They needed to know that their command and control systems could handle the stress of nuclear decision-making. They needed to prove that the mechanisms for presidential or prime ministerial authorization could function under time pressure. They needed to test whether the multilateral complexity of a nuclear alliance, where multiple nations with different languages and procedures had to coordinate the end of the world, could actually work. From the Soviet perspective, this looked like NATO was practicing a first strike. Because here's the thing about nuclear strategy. There's no practical difference between practicing for a retaliatory second strike and practicing for an aggressive first strike. The procedures are the same, the communications are the same, the weapons are the same. If you're watching from the outside, you can't tell whether someone is rehearsing defense or rehearsing offense. And the Soviets, watching Able Archer unfold with increasing alarm, were starting to believe this wasn't defense. In the underground command centers beneath Moscow, military planners began running their own calculations. If NATO was indeed preparing to strike, what would Soviet response look like? How much warning would they have? How quickly could they get their own missiles and bombers launched? The answer to that last question was very quickly. Soviet doctrine emphasized rapid response. Their ICBMs were kept at high readiness. Their strategic bomber force practiced immediate launch procedures. If the order came down, they could begin launching within minutes. The machinery of response was being prepared. Systems were being checked. Crews were being briefed. Not because anyone had decided to start a war, but because following doctrine in the face of apparent threat required preparation. And preparation, when dealing with nuclear weapons, looks an awful lot like the beginning of the end of the world. Able Archer introduced simulated alert levels that mirrored actual NATO procedures for nuclear escalation. The exercise began at a low level of tension and gradually increased. Day by day, the simulated threat level rose. Imaginary Soviet forces invaded imaginary Western Europe. NATO's response escalated accordingly. The simulation moved from conventional defense to tactical nuclear release to strategic nuclear exchange. It followed the ladder of escalation perfectly, exactly as it would in a real war. Soviet intelligence agencies intercepted communications about dispersing nuclear-capable aircraft. They tracked simulated orders for missile units to prepare for launch. They watched as NATO practiced the procedures that would, in reality, precede the end of the world. And here's where the conspiracy framing becomes essential. If you were a Soviet intelligence analyst in November 1983, how would you distinguish between a very realistic exercise and actual war preparation? The answer is, you probably couldn't. NATO had made Able Archer so realistic, so different from previous drills, that it was functionally indistinguishable from the real thing. The exercise had crossed a line. It had become too convincing, and the Soviets were watching very, very closely. Chapter 4. The Soviet Lens. To understand Soviet reaction to Able Archer, you need to understand Operation Ryan. Ryan was a Soviet intelligence program that had been running since 1981. The name was an acronym in Russian, Raketno-Yadernoye Napadenie, which translates to nuclear missile attack. Operation Ryan was designed to detect indicators that the United States was preparing to launch a surprise nuclear first strike against the Soviet Union. This wasn't paranoia for its own sake. Soviet strategic thinking was based on a fundamental assumption. that the United States would attack first if it believed it could win. The whole concept of mutually assured destruction rested on both sides, knowing that neither could strike without being destroyed in return. But what if one side developed the capability to eliminate the other's nuclear arsenal before they could respond? What if Star Wars missile defense actually worked? What if NATO could decapitate Soviet leadership and destroy enough missiles that a counterattack would fail? These weren't abstract questions in Moscow, they were existential fears. Operation Ryan instructed Soviet intelligence officers around the world to watch for specific indicators. Were Western leaders suddenly travelling less? That might mean they were staying close to bunkers. Were blood banks in NATO countries increasing their stockpiles? That might mean preparation for casualties. Were there unusual movements of military personnel, changes in communication patterns, increased activity at nuclear weapons storage sites? The program was comprehensive, and by 1983 it was in full effect. Every Soviet embassy, every intelligence station, every agent in the West had a checklist of warning signs to monitor. And then Able Archer started. Suddenly every indicator on the Operation Ryan checklist began lighting up. NATO communications shifted to encrypted channels. Senior officials moved to secure locations. Nuclear-capable aircraft went on alert, at least according to the simulated exercise. But Soviet intelligence didn't always know what was simulation and what was real. From Moscow's perspective, this looked exactly like what they'd been told to watch for. This looked like the Americans were preparing to strike. Yuri Andropov was briefed on the developments. The dying leader of the Soviet Union, already deeply suspicious of Western intentions, received reports that NATO was rehearsing nuclear war with unprecedented realism. His intelligence chiefs told him this was different from previous drills. This was something new. And Andropov made a decision. If NATO was preparing for war, the Soviet Union needed to be ready to respond. Chapter 5. The alarms no one heard. What happened next is still partially classified, but enough has been declassified to reconstruct the basic outline. And it's terrifying. Soviet military forces in East Germany and Poland began moving to higher alert levels. This wasn't part of any exercise. This was real. Nuclear-capable aircraft, actual bombers carrying actual weapons, were placed on high readiness. Some reports suggest that pilots were briefed for immediate launch missions. Missile units received preparatory orders. The Soviet Union began responding to Able Archer as if it were the opening move of World War III. And NATO had no idea. Let's be specific about what higher alert levels actually means in this context, because the clinical language hides the reality of what was happening. At Fino Air Base in East Germany, crews of Soviet Yak-28 Brewer bombers were ordered to their aircraft on the morning of November the 7th. These weren't conventional bombers, they were nuclear strike aircraft, each capable of carrying a single tactical nuclear bomb. Under normal circumstances, even during exercises, these planes would sit on the flight line with their weapons stored separately in secure bunkers. The process of mating aircraft to nuclear weapons was elaborate, carefully controlled and documented. It didn't happen casually. But on November 7th, ground crews began the preparation procedures. Weapons storage igloos were opened, armed guards established perimeters. Technical personnel began the checklist for moving the weapons from storage to the aircraft. Reports suggest, though this has never been fully confirmed, that at least some aircraft were actually armed with live nuclear weapons during this period. Think about what that means. Soviet bombers sitting on runways in East Germany with nuclear bombs attached, pilots in cockpits or in ready rooms nearby, waiting for launch orders. These aircraft had a combat radius of about 1,000 kilometres. From Fino they could reach targets across West Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium and northern France, within an hour of takeoff. Major NATO bases, command centres, cities, all within range. And this was real. This wasn't a simulation or an exercise or a drill. This was the Soviet Air Force preparing for actual nuclear combat operations in response to what they believed was an impending NATO attack. At the same time, Soviet missile units in western portions of the USSR began elevated readiness procedures. The SS-20 missiles, The same intermediate-range systems that peace protesters in Europe had been demonstrating against were brought to higher states of preparation. These missiles were road-mobile, designed to be difficult to target. Under normal circumstances, they'd be dispersed in secure locations, their exact positions known only to their crews and command. But elevated readiness meant something different. Crews received briefings on potential targets. Launch coordinates were loaded into guidance computers. The missiles themselves were checked and rechecked. Fuel, systems were tested. The elaborate security protocols that govern nuclear weapons were stepped through, stage by stage, getting closer to the point where a launch order could be executed in minutes rather than hours. In the Baltic, Soviet submarines received coded messages instructing them to assume launch positions. These were Delta-class ballistic missile submarines, each carrying 16 SS N-18 missiles. Each missile could carry 3 nuclear warheads. A single submarine represented the destructive power to annihilate dozens of cities, and they were being moved into positions where they'd have optimal firing solutions on American targets. The pattern was consistent across Soviet forces in the European theatre. Preparation for immediate nuclear combat, not mobilization for conventional war. That would have been more visible, requiring massive troop movements and logistical preparations. This was the specific targeted readiness of nuclear forces getting ready to launch. And here's where the story becomes almost unbearable. While NATO commanders were running their simulation, while they were playing out scenarios and testing communication systems in bunkers and command posts across Europe, the other side was preparing for actual nuclear war. The exercise was producing real-world consequences that the people running the exercise didn't know about. Why didn't they know? Intelligence is supposed to prevent this. The United States had satellites watching Soviet military bases. The National Security Agency had listening posts intercepting Soviet communications. NATO's own intelligence apparatus monitored Warsaw Pact activities constantly. CIA operatives, MI6 agents, and other Western intelligence services had sources inside the Soviet military establishment. All of this existed. All of it was functioning. But none of it provided warning fast enough or clear enough to alert NATO to what was happening. Part of the problem was interpretation. Western satellites did pick up increased activity at Soviet air bases. Radio intercepts did note changes in communication patterns. But this was interpreted as the Soviets conducting their own exercises in response to NATO's Able Archer, which it was in a sense, except it wasn't an exercise. It was preparation for actual war motivated by the belief that Able Archer was a cover for a real NATO attack. The distinction is critical. NATO intelligence analysts, looking at Soviet activity through the lens of their own knowledge that Able Archer was just a drill, assumed Soviet responses were proportional. They thought, we're running an exercise, so the Soviets are running a counter-exercise. They're watching us practice, so they're practicing too. It made sense. It was logical. It was also catastrophically wrong. The Soviet responses weren't exercises. They were actual combat preparations. The bombers being armed were being armed with real weapons intended for real targets. The missiles being readied were being readied for real launches. The submarines moving into position were moving into position for real strikes. But from NATO headquarters, watching the intelligence reports come in, it looked routine. Soviet military activity increases during NATO exercises. That was expected. Nothing in the report screamed emergency. Nothing suggested that the other side genuinely believed war was imminent. And this raises the conspiracy question that haunts this entire event. Did Western intelligence actually miss the signals, or did someone know and decide not to escalate by acknowledging it? There's a third possibility, more disturbing than either ignorance or deliberate concealment: selective awareness. It's possible that some intelligence analysts looking at the data began to suspect that Soviet responses were more serious than routine counter-exercises. It's possible that reports were written expressing concern. But in the bureaucratic machinery of Cold War intelligence, those concerns might not have been elevated properly. Reports might have been filed and forgotten, lost in the daily flood of intelligence data that poured into Western capitals. Or perhaps someone did recognize the danger, and worked quietly to de-escalate without making it official. There are hints in declassified documents that back-channel communications may have occurred during Able Archer. Unofficial contacts between Western and Soviet intelligence officers, passing messages that couldn't be sent through formal diplomatic channels. Quiet assurances that this was indeed just an exercise, nothing more. We don't know for certain. The full truth may still be classified, or it may be buried in archives that haven't been fully explored, or it may exist only in the memories of people who were there and have chosen to remain silent. What we do know is that nuclear armed forces on both sides were at heightened alert, and the public was going about their lives completely unaware. In London, people were shopping for Christmas gifts. The holiday season was approaching. In New York, the stock market was trading normally. In Moscow, citizens were queuing for bread and trying to stay warm as winter settled in. In Paris, in Rome, in Washington, in every city that would have been vaporized if the situation had spiraled just slightly further out of control, people were living ordinary lives. They had no idea that in East German air bases and Polish missile sites and underground command bunkers scattered across the Soviet Union, military officers were going through checklists that ended with nuclear launches. They didn't know that weapons were being armed, that coordinates were being loaded, that the machinery of apocalypse was humming to life. And maybe that ignorance was mercy. Maybe it was better not to know, because what could anyone have done? If the truth had been announced, if governments had gone on television and radio and said, the Soviets think we're about to attack and they're preparing to launch their weapons, what would have happened? Panic, probably. Certainly panic. People trying to flee cities, runs on grocery stores, chaos in the streets, and that chaos might have convinced the Soviets that they were right, that the West was mobilizing for war, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy where fear of war triggers the very war that was feared. So the silence continued. NATO ran its exercise. The Soviets prepared their response, and the world spun on, oblivious to how close it was to ending. Chapter 6. The Human Factor. The thing about nuclear weapons is that they don't launch themselves. Systems can be automated up to a point, but ultimately people make the decision. And in November 1983, that human element may be what saved us. Soviet doctrine required multiple layers of confirmation before nuclear release. Local commanders could prepare weapons, could move to launch positions, but they couldn't fire without authorization from Moscow. Even in the midst of Operation Ryan paranoia, even with Andropov receiving alarming reports about NATO activity, the system required human judgment, and humans hesitated. Let's talk about what hesitation looks like in a nuclear command bunker when you believe the end of the world might be starting. Imagine you're a Soviet Air Force commander at a base in East Germany. It's November 7th, 1983. You've received orders to bring your nuclear-capable bombers to high readiness. Your intelligence briefing told you that NATO appears to be preparing for a surprise attack. Your weapons are being armed, your pilots are standing by, you're running through final checklists, and then you pause, you look at the orders again, you look at the intelligence assessment, you think about what you're being told versus what you're seeing. Yes, NATO communications have changed. Yes, senior officials have moved to bunkers. Yes, there's increased activity at weapon storage sites. But has anyone actually seen NATO forces mobilizing for attack? Have any bombers taken off? Have any missiles been fueled for launch? The intelligence says NATO is preparing, but preparing could mean many things. It could mean they're about to attack, or it could mean they're running a very realistic exercise, or it could mean they're responding to something else entirely, maybe to our own increased readiness. So you pick up the phone, you call your superior officer, you ask for clarification. Is this confirmed? Are we certain this isn't just their annual exercise? Should we really be arming weapons based on preparations rather than actual attacks? This conversation happened. We don't know exactly who had it or in precisely what form, but we know from declassified documents and from interviews with former Soviet military personnel that questions were asked. Orders were questioned, confirmation was requested, and that questioning, that insistence on verification created delays. Time passed while reports were checked and double-checked. Minutes turned into hours, and those hours mattered. Because in nuclear strategy, timing is everything. If you're going to launch a surprise first strike, you do it decisively and completely. You don't give the enemy time to prepare, time to disperse forces, time to get their own weapons ready to launch. The whole point of a first strike is that it's sudden, overwhelming and paralysing. But Able Archer wasn't sudden. It had been running for days. It was escalating gradually, following a predictable timeline, and the more Soviet officers looked at that pattern, the less it looked like an actual attack, and the more it looked like exactly what it was, an exercise. There's a parallel here to Stanislav Petrov, the Soviet officer who, in September 1983, just 2 months before Able Archer, received what appeared to be confirmation that American ICBMs were inbound. His early warning system showed multiple launches. Protocol said to report it immediately, but Petrov made a judgment call. He decided it was a false alarm, reasoning that an actual first strike would involve hundreds of missiles, not just 5. He was right. It was a malfunction, and he prevented a retaliatory launch that would have started a nuclear war. Petrov became famous later when his story was declassified. The world learned that one man's judgment, one person's willingness to trust his analysis over his instruments, had prevented Armageddon. He was celebrated as the man who saved the world, though he himself always downplayed his role. He said he was just doing his job, just following his training, just using common sense. But how many other Petrovs were there during Able Archer? How many people in the Soviet chain of command looked at the data and said, "This doesn't quite add up"? How many times did someone reach for the phone to authorise a launch and then pause just for a moment and decide to wait for more information? We'll probably never know all their names. Some of them might not even realise they were part of this story. They might have thought they were just being appropriately cautious, just following good practice, just doing the thorough job their training required. They didn't know that their caution, their scepticism, their insistence on verification was the thin barrier between civilization and nuclear holocaust. Consider the perspective of an intelligence analyst in Moscow reading reports from the field. You've been told for months that the Americans might launch a surprise attack. You've been watching for indicators, and now, during Able Archer, many of those indicators are present. Your job is to assess the data and provide recommendations to military leadership. But you're also aware that intelligence can be wrong. You've seen exercises before. You know that NATO runs drills. You understand that increased activity during an exercise is normal, so you sit at your desk looking at the reports and you have to make a call. Is this the real thing? Or is this what a realistic exercise looks like? If you say it's real and you're wrong, you'll look foolish. You'll have panicked over nothing. Your career might suffer, but the world will continue. If you say it's an exercise and you're wrong, millions of people will die, and your country will be destroyed, including you, including everyone you know, including every city you've ever visited, and every person you've ever met. That's the decision, and it's not hypothetical. It's real. It's happening right now, in this moment, with actual weapons being armed, and actual bombers being fueled, and actual missile crews running through actual checklists. What do? The answer, thankfully, is that enough Soviet intelligence analysts chose caution. They wrote their assessments noting the unusual characteristics of Able Archer, yes. They recommended increased readiness, yes. But they also included caveats. They acknowledged uncertainty. They admitted that the data could be interpreted multiple ways, and those caveats, those admissions of uncertainty, gave military commanders room to hesitate. It wasn't a definitive, "This is an attack, launch everything now." It was, "This looks suspicious, be prepared, but wait for confirmation." That's not as dramatic as a hero slamming his fist on a table and refusing to launch despite direct orders, but it's probably more accurate to what actually happened. The system didn't fail because someone heroically overrode it. The system worked, barely, because people used judgment instead of automatically following procedures. In the underground command bunkers beneath Moscow, where the final decisions about nuclear release would have been made, military officers were watching the situation unfold. They had the reports from the field. They knew about NATO's exercise, they knew about their own forces' elevated readiness. They understood that the machinery was in motion, that weapons were being armed, that crews were standing by. And they waited. They didn't wait because they were cowards or because they were indecisive. They waited because they were doing exactly what their training told them to do. Verify before acting. Don't launch on ambiguous information. Don't start a nuclear war unless you're certain. That certainty never came. The data stayed ambiguous. NATO continued its exercise, but no actual attack materialized. The bombers that Soviet intelligence had worried about never took off on strike missions. The missiles that might have been fueled for launch never launched. The warning time that should have been shrinking, the minutes between detecting an attack and having to respond, never collapsed to zero. So the officers in Moscow waited and waited. And as hours passed without any actual attack occurring, the interpretation of the intelligence began to shift. Maybe this really was just an exercise after all. Maybe NATO was just testing their systems in an unusually realistic way. Maybe the Americans weren't preparing to attack. The elevated readiness continued. You don't stand down immediately when you're dealing with nuclear weapons. But the urgency decreased. The sense of imminent danger receded. Preparations continued, but they continued as contingency rather than immediate response. And on November 11th, when Able Archer concluded, when NATO forces stood down and returned to normal status, when the exercise ended without any missiles flying or bombs dropping, Soviet military leadership could finally conclude with confidence. It had been a drill. Just a drill. A provocative, realistic, deeply unsettling drill, but not an actual attack. Orders went out to Soviet forces to return to normal readiness levels. Bombers were de-armed. Missiles stood down. Submarines returned to their patrol areas. The machinery of nuclear war, which had been humming at the edge of activation, powered down. And the people who had made the decisions to wait, to verify, to hesitate, they went back to their normal duties. They filed their reports. They conducted their debriefs. They moved on to the next crisis, the next intelligence assessment, the next decision. They didn't know they had saved the world. From their perspective, they had just done their jobs correctly. They had assessed ambiguous intelligence with appropriate caution. They had recommended prudent preparedness without overreacting. They had followed doctrine and maintained discipline. But that's exactly what saved us. Not heroism, not dramatic last-minute interventions, just professionals doing professional work with appropriate skepticism and thoroughness. We like to think that systems keep us safe. We build elaborate command structures and fail-safes and protocols precisely because we don't trust individual judgment. But in November 1983, the systems nearly failed. The system saw indicators of war and processed them according to programming. The system said, prepare to launch. It was people, imperfect, uncertain, frightened people, who stopped it. And the most terrifying thing about this entire story is that we don't actually know how close we came. Were we minutes from launch? Hours? Days? Did Soviet commanders have their fingers on the metaphorical trigger, one more piece of alarming intelligence away from giving the order? Or was the danger less immediate than it appeared? Were there additional safeguards and verification procedures that would have prevented launch, even if orders had been given? Did the system have more resilience than we give it credit for? The declassified documents don't tell us. The people who were there, when they speak about it at all, tend to downplay the danger. Military officers on both sides have a professional interest in maintaining that everything was under control, that procedures worked, as designed, that the risk was manageable. But the pattern of what happened suggests otherwise. The pattern suggests a system that came very, very close to catastrophic failure, held together only by individual humans making individual choices to pause, to question, to wait just a little longer before doing something irreversible. And if that's true, then we survived Able Archer not because we were smart or well prepared, or because our systems were robust. We survived because we were lucky. Lucky that the right people were in the right positions at the right time. Lucky that enough of them chose caution over protocol. Lucky that the ambiguity of the intelligence never quite resolved into certainty. That's not a comforting thought, because luck runs out eventually, and a world that depends on luck to avoid nuclear war is a world living on borrowed time. Chapter 7. The exercise ends. Able Archer. 83 concluded on November 11th, 1983. NATO. Commanders reviewed the results, assessed the performance of their communication systems, wrote up reports on lessons learned. From their perspective, the exercise had been a success. They had tested their procedures under realistic conditions. They had identified some weaknesses in coordination between member nations. They had practiced the unthinkable and proven that the systems could function. NATO stood down. Officers returned to normal duty. The simulated war ended, and everyone went back to the real Cold War, which seemed, by comparison, relatively stable. No public announcement was made about any danger. No press release went out saying, we just ran a drill and it nearly triggered a nuclear war. There was no presidential address, no emergency session of the United Nations, no hotline call between Washington and Moscow to smooth things over. The moment just quietly passed. Soviet forces gradually stepped down from alert. Aircraft returned to normal readiness. Missile units stood down. Whatever orders had been issued were rescinded. The intelligence reports that had alarmed Moscow were re-evaluated in the light of the exercise ending without any attack. Andropov and his advisors presumably concluded that they had been watching a drill after all, though how they came to that conclusion and when remains murky. Did they realise it before the exercise ended, or only after? Did someone in Soviet intelligence finally confirm it was a simulation? Or did they simply note that when Able Archer ended no missiles flew, and therefore it must have been fake? We don't fully know. What we do know is that the world continued as normal. People went to work, children went to school. The news that night in America probably led with something about Beirut or Grenada or the economy. In the Soviet Union, state media reported whatever state media reported in those days. No one told the public that they had been hours or days or perhaps just minutes away from annihilation, and for years, almost no one knew. Chapter 8. What was discovered later? The truth about Able Archer. 83 emerged slowly in fragments over the course of decades. It wasn't a single revelation. It was a gradual accumulation of declassified documents, debriefs of defectors, and the piecing together of intelligence reports that had been filed and forgotten. The first hints came from Oleg Gordievsky, a KGB colonel who was actually a British double agent. Gordievsky had been stationed in London during Able Archer and had sent reports back to Moscow about NATO activities. He was in a unique position. He knew what the British and NATO were actually doing, running an exercise, and he also knew how Moscow was interpreting those actions. In his reports to the KGB, Gordievsky described British preparations for Able Archer. He noted the participation of senior officials. He documented the increased security around certain facilities. He did exactly what Soviet intelligence had instructed him to do under Operation Ryan: watch for signs of Western preparations for nuclear war. But Gordievsky also knew that Able Archer was just a drill. He had access to British intelligence briefings. He understood it was a simulation, and he tried carefully to indicate this in his reports without compromising his cover. He would note that British officials were treating it as an exercise, that there was no sense of actual crisis in London, that normal life was continuing. Moscow ignored those qualifications. They saw what they wanted to see in his reports: confirmation that something big was happening in NATO, the nuance, the context, the signs that it was routine. All of that was filtered out. What reached decision-makers was the alarming parts: senior officials moving, security increasing, communications changing. After Gordievsky defected to the West in 1985, he revealed the extent of Soviet paranoia during Able Archer. In his debriefings with British intelligence, he described Operation Ryan in detail. He explained the checklist of indicators that Soviet agents had been instructed to watch for. He recounted the assessments that had been sent to Moscow and how they had been interpreted. Western intelligence agencies were stunned. They had assumed the Soviets understood Able Archer was an exercise. The possibility that Moscow had taken it seriously, that they had actually prepared to launch, had never occurred to them. Or if it had occurred to someone, that concern had never been elevated to decision-makers. Throughout the late 80s and 90s, more documents were declassified. This process was slow and piecemeal. The end of the Cold War in 1991 opened some Soviet archives, but not all. Russian military and intelligence services remained secretive about their Cold War operations. What information did emerge often came from defectors, from captured documents, or from the gradual declassification of Western intelligence assessments. Analysts began reviewing what had happened in November 1983 with fresh eyes. Reports that had seemed routine at the time were suddenly alarming in hindsight. A CIA assessment from November 8, 1983, noted unusual Soviet Air Force activity in East Germany. At the time, this had been filed as a predictable response to NATO exercises. Reading it years later, with the knowledge that the Soviets had genuinely feared an attack, that same report became evidence of how close things had come to disaster. An NSA intercept log showed Soviet military communications shifting to higher security protocols on November 6th. Again, this had been noted but not flagged as critical. In hindsight, it indicated that Soviet forces were preparing for actual combat operations, not conducting exercises. Satellite imagery reviewed years later showed Soviet bombers being moved at bases across Eastern Europe during the Able Archer period. The original analysis had categorized this as routine repositioning. The reanalysis suggested it was dispersal for combat operations, getting aircraft spread out so they couldn't all be destroyed in a single strike. All these pieces of intelligence had been collected at the time, but they hadn't been assembled into a coherent picture that screamed emergency. The analysts watching in real time couldn't see the pattern because they were operating under the assumption that their own exercise was transparently just an exercise. In 2003, a previously classified President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board report was released. This document, prepared in 1990, reviewed the Able Archer incident using newly available information from defectors and declassified Soviet documents. Its conclusions were stark. The report stated that Able Archer 83 had brought the superpowers closer to nuclear war than at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. It acknowledged that NATO had badly misjudged Soviet perception and that the exercise had been potentially dangerous. It noted that Soviet military forces had been placed on higher alert and that this had occurred without NATO's knowledge or intention. But even more significant than what the report said was when it said it. The report was written in 1990, 7 years after Able Archer. It was classified until 2003, 20 years after the event. Think about that timeline. Able Archer happened in 1983. The US government realised how dangerous it had been by 1990, and the American public wasn't told until 2003. An entire generation grew up never knowing that their parents had nearly been incinerated in a nuclear holocaust, triggered by a training exercise. Why the delay? Why keep it classified for another 13 years after the Cold War had ended and the Soviet Union had collapsed? The official explanation was that the report contained sensitive information about intelligence sources and methods. Releasing it earlier might have compromised ongoing operations or revealed capabilities that needed to remain secret. But there's another interpretation. Acknowledging how close we came to accidental nuclear war would have required admitting that the entire framework of nuclear deterrence had been far more fragile than anyone wanted to believe. It would have meant confronting uncomfortable questions about whether the system that was supposed to keep us safe had actually been the greatest threat to our survival. Western analysts who reviewed the incident in subsequent years came to some disturbing conclusions. One finding was that NATO's exercise design had been fundamentally flawed. By making Able Archer so realistic, by changing procedures from previous years, by incorporating high-level leadership participation, without adequately communicating these changes to the Soviets, NATO had created conditions ripe for misperception. Another finding was that intelligence sharing between NATO and the Warsaw Pact was dangerously inadequate. Both sides monitored each other constantly, but there were no effective mechanisms for clarifying intent. When something unusual happened, there was no quick way to say, "This is just an exercise, don't worry." The assumption was that both sides would recognise routine activities as routine. Able Archer proved that assumption wrong. A third finding, perhaps most troubling, was that Operation Ryan had created a self-fulfilling prophecy dynamic. Soviet intelligence was looking for signs of an American first strike. When they found those signs, or thought they did, they responded by preparing their own forces. Those preparations then looked, from the American side, like Soviet aggression, or at minimum like concerning military activity, which could have prompted American responses, which the Soviets would have interpreted as further confirmation of attack preparations, creating a spiral of misperception and response that could have ended in catastrophe. Some researchers went further, suggesting that there may have been other close calls during the Able Archer period that remain classified or unknown. If the Soviets armed nuclear weapons at multiple bases, if submarine commanders received preparatory orders for launch, if missile crews began countdown procedures, we might not know the full extent of what happened. The Soviet Union collapsed, but not all its records were preserved or made available. Some participants have died, some documents were destroyed, some stories may never be told. In 2013, a 30th anniversary retrospective in Foreign Policy magazine quoted former NATO officials expressing surprise at how seriously the Soviets had taken the exercise. One retired general was quoted saying, "We had no idea. We were just doing our jobs, testing our systems. If someone had told us the Russians thought we were actually preparing to attack, we would have stopped immediately." That quote is revealing. It suggests that right up through 2013, 30 years after the event, some of the people who had participated in Able Archer still didn't fully grasp the danger. Or perhaps they did grasp it, but couldn't quite accept it. Because accepting it meant accepting that they had nearly triggered Armageddon through ignorance rather than malice, through lack of imagination rather than aggression. The official line became that Able Archer was a misunderstanding, a failure of communication, a case where both sides had legitimate reasons for their actions, but had misread each other's intentions. That framing is convenient. It's clinical. It treats Able Archer as a learning experience, a close call that taught valuable lessons about the importance of transparency and communication during military exercises. But it also downplays just how close we came. It sanitizes the terror. It suggests that the system worked, when in fact the system nearly destroyed everything. It implies that cooler heads prevailed, when what actually happened was that confused people in impossible situations made marginally correct choices based on incomplete information and tremendous uncertainty. The full declassification of Able Archer-related documents continues even today. Files are still being released, still being analysed. Researchers continue finding new details, new evidence of just how dangerous that week in November 1983 actually was. And each new revelation makes the original silence more troubling. Because if this was as close as the evidence now suggests, if we really were minutes or hours from nuclear launches, then the decision to keep it quiet for decades wasn't just about protecting intelligence sources. It was about protecting the myth that nuclear deterrence was stable and controlled and safe. That myth was important. It allowed people to sleep at night. It allowed governments to justify the enormous expense of nuclear arsenals. It allowed strategists to claim that MAD worked, that the balance of terror prevented war, that we had everything under control. Able Archer revealed that we didn't have everything under control, that the balance was more precarious than anyone wanted to admit, that nuclear war could start not from aggression, but from misunderstanding, not from intention, but from mistake. And that truth was deemed too dangerous to tell, at least for 20 years, maybe longer. Because even now, with many documents declassified, we still don't know everything. Some files remain closed, some participants remain silent, some truths may be buried forever, but what we do know is enough. Enough to understand that Able Archer 83 was far more dangerous than the official narrative suggested. Enough to recognise that we survived by margins too narrow to be comfortable. Enough to question whether the Cold War nuclear standoff was ever as stable as we told ourselves it was. Chapter 9. The Conspiracy Interpretation. Here's where we enter the realm of conspiracy theory, though perhaps it's better described as conspiracy analysis. Because the question isn't whether Able Archer happened, it demonstrably did. The question is, what were we told about it, and why? Conspiracy theorists argue that governments on both sides downplayed the risk to avoid public panic. If the truth had come out immediately, that a NATO exercise had nearly triggered Soviet nuclear launch procedures, the public would have demanded answers. They would have asked how leaders could be so reckless. they would have questioned the entire framework of nuclear deterrence. Deterrence only works if both sides believe the other is rational and predictable. Able Archer revealed that the system was neither. It showed that a routine military exercise could spiral into Armageddon based on misperception. It demonstrated that all the careful game theory and strategic planning could be undone by simple miscommunication. Admitting that publicly would have been catastrophic for the doctrine that kept the Cold War cold, so instead, the theory goes, both sides agreed to bury it. The Soviets didn't want to admit they'd been paranoid, and nearly started a war over nothing. The Americans didn't want to admit they'd been careless, and nearly triggered a Holocaust with a training drill. Neither side had anything to gain from public disclosure. The conspiracy interpretation suggests that the world survived Able Archer by accident, not by design. That the systems we trusted to keep us safe had actually brought us to the brink. That the only reason we're alive to talk about it is that a few cautious individuals in the Soviet command structure happened to hesitate at the right moment, and that's a terrifying thing to admit. Because if Able Archer almost caused nuclear war, how many other close calls have there been? How many times have we teetered on the edge without knowing? How many near misses have been classified, buried, forgotten? The existence of Operation Ryan itself suggests that Soviet leadership believed a surprise. American first strike was not just possible but likely. Think about what that means. It means that for years, Soviet strategy was predicated on the assumption that the United States was actively planning to annihilate them. And American strategy was based on the assumption that the Soviets thought the same thing in reverse. Two superpowers, each convinced the other was preparing to attack first, each building weapon systems designed to launch on warning, each watching the other with intelligence programs designed to spot the slightest sign of preparation. It's a miracle we survived. And the conspiracy theory says, maybe our survival wasn't because of good planning or strong leadership or effective deterrence. Maybe it was just luck. Maybe we rolled the dice 100 times, 1,000 times, and happened not to come up snake eyes until the whole game ended with the fall of the Soviet Union. That's not a comforting thought. It suggests that nuclear deterrence was always more fragile than we were told, that the Emperor had no clothes, that the experts didn't actually have everything under control, that we were all living on borrowed time and didn't know it. And if that's true, then the conspiracy wasn't a cover-up of malice. It was a cover-up of incompetence and terrifying randomness. Chapter 10. Why we never talk about it. Ask most people about near-nuclear disasters, and they'll mention the Cuban Missile Crisis. Some might know about Stanislav Petrov. A few might reference accidents like broken arrows or false alarms. For Able Archer, it's barely discussed outside of specialist circles. Why? Partly, it's because nothing actually happened. The Cuban Missile Crisis had visible drama. Ships, blockades, Kennedy on television, Khrushchev banging his shoe. It had narrative clarity. Able Archer was invisible. It happened in bunkers and command posts and encrypted radio traffic. There were no photos, no speeches, no public confrontations. Near misses without explosions are easy to bury. They don't generate compelling headlines. They don't make good movies. They're abstract, technical, difficult to explain. But there's another reason we don't talk about Able Archer, and it's more disturbing. Acknowledging it means acknowledging how fragile everything was. The Cold War narrative, we tell ourselves, is one of steady hands and rational actors. We frame it as a dangerous but manageable standoff, kept stable by smart leaders and careful diplomacy. We tell a story where the system worked, where deterrence held, where wisdom prevailed. Able Archer complicates that narrative. It suggests that we survived not because of brilliant strategy, but despite catastrophic miscommunication. It implies that the whole edifice of nuclear deterrence was built on assumptions that turned out to be wrong. Both sides assumed the other would recognize a drill as a drill. They were wrong. Both sides assumed their intelligence was good enough to distinguish simulation from reality. They were wrong. Both sides assumed that escalation could be controlled, that there were enough safeguards and checks and balances to prevent accidental war. And they were very nearly wrong about that too. Talking about Able Archer means confronting the possibility that we didn't end the Cold War through skill or virtue, but through sheer dumb luck. That we made it to 1991 not because we were smart enough or careful enough, but because we were lucky enough. And that's a hard thing to accept. It means that all the sacrifices, all the defence spending, all the carefully crafted strategies might have been for nothing. It means that the thing that saved us wasn't MAD or SDI or any acronym, it was chance. The real horror of Able Archer isn't that someone intended to start a war. It's that no one did. Both sides were following their procedures. Both sides were acting rationally according to their information. Both sides thought they were being prudent and careful. And they almost destroyed the world anyway. That's worse than malice. Malice can be opposed. Mistakes can be corrected. But systemic failure, the kind where everyone does their job right and disaster happens anyway, that's existential terror. So we don't talk about it. We remember the crises that were resolved, the moments where leadership made a difference, the times when the system worked. We don't dwell on the times it almost didn't, because dwelling on that means questioning whether any of it was ever really under control. Epilogue. The silence after Able Archer. 83 ended on November 11th, 1983. The Cold War continued for another 8 years. Missiles remained in silos. Submarines prowled the oceans. Bombers flew their routes. The world kept turning, kept building, kept living under the shadow of potential annihilation. But something had changed, even if the public didn't know it. Reagan, according to some accounts, was shaken by reports of how seriously the Soviets had taken the exercise. He had believed his rhetoric about the evil empire was just that, rhetoric. He hadn't fully grasped that Moscow might genuinely fear an American first strike. Able Archer gave him a different perspective. Some historians credit it with softening his approach in his second term, with making him more willing to negotiate with Gorbachev when the opportunity arose. In Moscow, the incident reinforced existing paranoia, but also highlighted the danger of misperception. Soviet leadership began to understand that their own fear could be as dangerous as any American weapon. Neither side made dramatic changes. There was no hotline conversation where they agreed to be more careful, but there were subtle shifts. Military exercises became slightly less provocative. Intelligence sharing improved marginally. The superpowers learned, without ever quite admitting it, that they had to be more transparent about their actions or risk stumbling into the war neither wanted. The Cold War did not end because systems were perfect. It ended because at critical moments people paused. Because someone, somewhere, in the Soviet chain of command in November 1983 looked at the data and decided to wait. Because enough individuals, whose names we may never know, chose verification over assumption, caution over protocol, peace over procedure. We survived Able Archer 83. We survived the Cold War. But we survived by margins that would horrify us if we fully understood them. The most dangerous war in history, a nuclear war that never happened, almost began as a training exercise. It almost started not because of aggression or ideology or conflict, but because of confusion. Because one side's simulation looked to the other side exactly like the real thing. And the silence that followed, the decades of not talking about it, tells us something important. Sometimes the closest calls are the ones we're least willing to acknowledge. Because acknowledging them means admitting that we were never really in control, that the systems we built to keep us safe were themselves the danger, that we trusted our lives to mechanisms that could fail in ways we never imagined. Able Archer was supposed to be a drill. It was supposed to be predictable, routine, safe. Instead, it became a week where the world balanced on a knife's edge, where nuclear forces prepared for launch, where the apocalypse was averted not by grand strategy, but by individual human beings who chose, in the moment, not to press the button. They didn't know they were saving the world. They probably thought they were just being cautious, just following their training, just doing their jobs, with appropriate care. But that's exactly the point. The world didn't end because heroes rose to the occasion. It didn't end because someone made a brilliant decision or took a courageous stand. It didn't end because anonymous, ordinary people doing ordinary jobs made ordinary choices to double-check, to verify, to wait just a little longer before doing something irreversible. The week the world almost ended teaches us that nuclear war doesn't require villains. It doesn't need madmen or warmongers or evil empires. It just needs two sides who misunderstand each other, who assume they know what the other is thinking, who build systems so complex and tightly coupled that a single miscalculation can trigger catastrophe. And the conspiracy, if there is one, isn't that Able Archer was invented or exaggerated. It's that we were never told how bad it really was. That the people who knew, who understood we'd been seconds or minutes or hours from the end, chose silence, chose to let the world continue in ignorance rather than confront the truth. Maybe they were right. Maybe the public couldn't have handled knowing. Maybe the panic would have been worse than the secret. Or maybe we deserve to know. Maybe we still deserve to know every time the world almost ends, every time the systems fail, every time we survive by accident rather than design. Because Able Archer wasn't unique. It was just the most dramatic example of a problem that persisted throughout the Cold War. The problem of two armed camps staring at each other in the dark, each seeing threats in every shadow, each ready to fire at the slightest provocation. We made it through. The Soviet Union collapsed. The Cold War ended. We tell ourselves we won. But maybe the real lesson of Able Archer 83 is that nobody wins in a game where the penalty for losing is extinction. We didn't win the Cold War. We survived it. And we survived it, in part, because of luck we didn't know we needed. The silence. After Able Archer is the silence of people who looked into the abyss and decided not to describe what they saw. It's the silence of governments that realised they'd been far more reckless than they understood. It's the silence of a world that came within a heartbeat of ending and then just went on, went back to work, went back to school, went back to life. And maybe that silence, that collective decision not to dwell on how close we came, was its own form of survival mechanism. Maybe we needed to forget in order to function. Maybe the full weight of knowing that we almost died, all of us, everyone, the entire human project, would have been too much to bear. But the story remains. The documents exist. The truth is out there, buried in declassified files and academic studies, and the memories of people who were there and knew what was happening and never told. Able Archer 83 was the week the world almost ended. It was the crisis that almost wasn't survived. It was the moment when the machinery of a nuclear deterrence, the system we built to keep us safe, nearly killed us all. And the fact that we're here, that you're listening to this, that we exist to tell the story, that's not because the system worked. It's because, for just long enough people in the right places made the right choices for the right reasons. And that's a terrifying thing to stake the survival of civilization on. But it's exactly what we did.